Okay, so now this is the moment everyone has been waiting for. One of the highlights of the annual research conference, Jacques Pollack Conference, here at the IMF, the Mundell-Fleming lecture. So I'm going to invite all of you to take your seat. And for this year's Mundell-Fleming lecture, it is my great pleasure to introduce Valerie Ramey. Valerie is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, a research fellow of the Center for Economic Policy and Research, and a professor emeritus at the University of California, San Diego, where she was before for, I believe, a number of years that we will not disclose. Valerie is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the Econometric Society. She's served as co-editor of the American Economic Review. She serves as a member of several National Science Foundation advisory panels, Federal Economic Statistics Advisory Committee, currently serves on a panel of economic advisors for the Congressional Budget Office and on the NBER Business Cycle Dating Committee. And she's an associate editor of the QJE and the co-editor of NBER Macroannual. So you can see that the list of her contributions and their status in the field is unparalleled. Valerie earned a PhD in economics from Stanford University, working under Bob Hall. She has published numerous scholarly articles and policy-relevant articles on macroeconomic topics, such as the sources of business cycles, the effects of monetary and fiscal policy, the impact of volatility on growth. She's written numerous articles on trends in wage inequality, trends in time use, such as the increase in time investments in children by educated parents. And her recent work has studied the size of government spending multipliers and has estimated the projected effects of climate change on economic growth. Now, her work has also been featured in major media, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. Now, Valerie is not really an open economy macroeconomist. And here at the fund and the Mundell-Fleming lecture, that's what we do day in and day out. So you might be asking yourself, well, okay, so what is going on here? And, well, there is a very good reason why we have Valerie today. Because as you could infer from what I just described to you, Valerie is really one of the world's experts when it comes to fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is an issue that sometimes, too often perhaps, at the IMF, we are looking at. And our Mundell-Fleming lecture today on the subject of cash transfers and their potential to stimulate macroeconomic activity is really an important topic for us and more broadly. We know many countries adopted fiscal stimulus strategies during economic downturns, like the global financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. And economic transfers, cash transfers, were a significant component of these packages in many, many countries. And the topic continues to be very timely and highly policy relevant at the current juncture of low growth, soaring public debt levels, and various kinds of supply shocks that are hitting economies, businesses, households, etc. And so as countries grapple with the enduring challenges of the post-pandemic era, it is very important to understand costs and benefits of cash transfers as a potential stimulus mechanism. And as I said, Valerie is probably the best person anywhere to teach us about this topic. And she will present in her lecture an overview of the relevant theoretical mechanisms that govern the macroeconomic effectiveness of fiscal transfers. Then she will draw on the experience of several and diverse countries, and she will scrutinize the data to assess the empirical plausibility of these theories. But let me allow Valerie to explain in details. Without further ado, welcome to the stage. Valerie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Pierre-Olivier. It's a great honor and a privilege to be asked to give the Mundell-Fleming lecture. And as Olivier said, particularly for me, because I've only done a few things in international macro. In fact, you might call me an international macro dropout, since I took Jose Vignal's class at Stanford when I was in grad school and was too confused by all the exchange rate puzzles and reverted to domestic macro. But when Pierre-Olivier told me what the theme of this conference was, I said, okay, I think I can say something about that would be useful. After all, IMF, some people say, is really, it's mostly fiscal. The second thing is I was inspired this year in terms of what I particularly will focus on by what I learned by being the chair of a committee that was doing an external evaluation of the Fiscal Affairs Department. In the process of that evaluation, my committee members and I read many, many documents from the IMF, mostly in fiscal affairs, but also WEO and other publications. And we interviewed many, many people. We talked to country representatives. Now, I've always greatly admired the IMF's work, but I have a much deeper understanding because I had no idea the depth and breadth and wonderful contributions they make to global economic growth and global stability in terms of their policy analysis. But one thing I noticed when I was reading all of this is the big challenge that they face when they are trying to give policy advice, and they have to go to estimates from the literature, and there's often a wide range of estimates. So how does one decide which estimate to use? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk both about a new methodology that I've put forward in some recent papers, and then I'm going to apply it to the case of cash transfers. So as you know, there are numerous countries during the last 2 decades have used Keynesian fiscal stimulus during the global financial crisis and COVID, and that temporary transfers was one important part of the package. They did many other things, such as infrastructure spending and all sorts of things like that, but transfers was also important. Now, when I reviewed the literature, what I thought we knew at the time, in my Journal of Economic Perspectives paper in 2019, I assessed the state of knowledge on government purchases and on taxes, but when I got to transfers, I noted that there isn't much evidence from aggregate data that transfers have much effect. So Romer and Romer had one paper, there were very few others. But we had a lot of micro estimates, and when you calibrated macro models with those estimates, they suggested that transfers could lead to big stimulus, and these are from models where there are some kinds of heterogeneous agents. Now, what I'm going to do in this lecture is reassess that dichotomy in terms of what the effect of transfers are, and I'm going to give you evidence that I think suggests that there is very little or no stimulus effect from transfers, at least in advanced economies, because that's all I've looked at so far. So, as an outline, I'm first just going to think about the historical context and the current state. One thing I'll talk about is just to remind ourselves how it is that Keynesian stimulus fell out of fashion and then was reborn, because it's useful to talk about. What the debt consequences are, most people here know, but it's always good to show those pictures. And then why it is that many people do think that transfers can have a significant stimulus effect. Then I'm going to overview this new method that some co-authors and I have introduced to try to limit the range of possible estimates that are plausible, and it's what we call historical plausibility analysis. Then I'm going to use some examples of that for temporary cash transfers. So first, I'll review the recent work that I've done with co-authors on the US rebates, tax rebates from 2001 to 2008. And then, because I'm trying to be a little bit more international, I'm going to go to Singapore and Australia and apply some of these there. And then I'll have some conclusions. So if you recall, Keynesian stimulus was pretty widely used. That was sort of the stabilization policy that people thought about from the 1930s to the 1970s. After the 1970s, monetary policy replaced fiscal policy as a stabilization tool. And it's good to remember why that was. And it's because there were new ideas and then also experiences. And it completely changed in the undergraduate textbooks. So I had spent years teaching all of these sorts of things. So the first is the life cycle permanent income hypothesis sort of replaced the Keynesian consumption function. Of course, Friedman and Modigliani came up with this in the 1950s, but ideas diffused a little bit more slowly to policymakers. And it was particularly important that, say, when Bob Hall added the implications from rational expectations in the late 70s. And these imply that if you give somebody a temporary transfer, the marginal propensity to consume should be very low because they should smooth it out, smooth their consumption out. The second piece of evidence is Friedman and Schwartz. Remember, there was the old debate between is fiscal policy more effective or is monetary policy? And I think that gradually people started believing Friedman and Schwartz and said, geez, monetary policy can be effective. But then the third thing is actually the experience. So fiscal policy has all sorts of intermediate and long-run goals. And so typically, and historically, in a number of instances, governments were very slow to pass stimulus packages, and so they would often pass them when the economy was already recovering, all right? In contrast, monetary policy is much more nimble, and it's for this reason that most of the textbooks that from the 80s and 90s and on said monetary policy is the way to combat recessions and inflation during expansions. Now, what led to a difference, to a change again, the rebirth of Keynesianism, was, of course, the global financial crisis. And what happened there, of course, is that central banks started cutting interest rates using monetary policy. But when they fell to the zero lower bound, suddenly they were running out of most of their ammunition. So policymakers looked at each other and said, does anybody still have the Keynesian playbook in their drawer? And they took out the Keynesian playbook and started doing transfers and government spending. Now, because there'd been this shift to using monetary policy, there were a lot of papers done on monetary policy, but very few on fiscal policy. So there were a few. So in my work with Matthew Shapiro, we didn't even mention the word multiplier. And Olivier with Roberto Perotti, they did talk about multipliers some, but there was very little research on the size of fiscal multipliers. So no one was quite sure what the effects of stimulus were. And people were calling me in 2008 and 2009. I said, well, maybe this, maybe that. You know, I wasn't sure. Now, fortunately, these events led to what I called a renaissance in fiscal research, and that's what I had summarized in my Journal of Economic Perspectives piece. Of course, unlike monetary policy, there are debt consequences of Keynesian fiscal stimulus. Virtually all the stimulus packages were deficit financed, since those should have more stimulative effects. And contrary to some theoretical arguments in the last decade or so, deficits so far have not financed themselves except through inflation. And in fact, every round of Keynesian stimulus has led to a ratchet up effect to debt GDP ratios. And this is something that was highlighted at Brookings in September by Auerbach and Yagan. It's a paper that I discussed there. So for example, let's look at advanced economies and emerging and developing economies. The first dotted red line is 2008, the second one is 2020. So you can see that debt, you know, on average debt was around 70% before the global financial crisis. It then ratcheted up above 100% and did not go back down. So it's just a ratchet up effect. And then again, with COVID, a huge ratchet up effect. Now there was a decline, but a lot of that was because of inflation, and then we're now still on an upward path. For the emerging market economies, they didn't have so much stimulus during the global financial crisis, but they did have more spending. Some of it was stimulus, but some of it was obviously things to deal with the pandemic. But that ratcheted it up, and then now they're on this path continuing to go upward. Now, the biggest debt increaser, of course, is the USA. So Europe has that ratchet effect to some extent, but they actually seem to have some fiscal consolidation later, whereas the US had a huge ratchet effect and then actually gradually went up a little bit until the next crisis and ratcheted back up again. And again, that little part downward is mostly inflation, and the US is continuing to soar upwards on the debt to GDP ratio. So we should ask, was it worth it? Okay, so why do many people believe that transfers can stimulate the economy? Well, most people weren't talking very much about multipliers for those several decades that I talked about. But there was this wonderful literature since the 1980s that was very active that would use household data and would test the permanent income hypothesis. Now, many of these papers rejected the permanent income hypothesis, and when they estimated MPCs, marginal propensities to consume, they found they were substantially higher than would be predicted by the permanent income hypothesis. So this is just a list of some of the names, a lot of them co-authored together and different combinations that are associated with that. Now, those high MPC estimates from micro, if led to the development of important new macro models, heterogeneous agent models, where you have high MPCs among some households because of either myopia or financial rigidities or other kinds of frictions. So examples, there are others, but those are some of the names associated with those models. Now, when you take those macro models and calibrate them with the MPCs, you get big multipliers. So I want to do a reassessment of this evidence using what I call historical plausibility analysis. So, as I was mentioning in my introduction, economists and policymakers often must choose among a wide range of estimates of the effects of a particular policy and then also models, okay? Now, in some cases, particularly for politicians, they might be tempted to choose the most convenient estimate that gives them an excuse to spend more. Now, what my co-authors, Jake Orchard and Johannes Wieland and I argue is that researchers and policymakers should subject the evidence and models to what we call a historical plausibility analysis. We talk about this in 2 recent papers, and we're building on some insights from some earlier work by Sam Shapiro and Slemrod, Chetty, and then some stuff I did in 2019. So here's kind of the idea behind it, is you create a historical counterfactual implied by the macro model for a particular period, calibrated with micro estimates, and then you assess the plausibility in the historical context. So the key ingredients that you need for this are, first of all, you need either micro or sub-regional estimates of key parameters that are relevant for macro. So these could be MPC, state, province, or city multipliers. You need a policy or event that's big enough to be visible in the aggregate data. Okay, that's absolutely key. Now, you don't necessarily have to have the micro estimates from that episode, although whatever episode those micro estimates are from should have similar conditions, like they should be advanced economies or things like that. All right, so it needs to be visible in the aggregate data. You need a macro model that translates those micro or sub-regional estimates to general equilibrium effects, and then a narrative analysis and or forecast from the historical period surrounding the policy or event to assess whether that macro counterfactual is plausible. So 2 examples, I'll talk about the 2001 and 2008 rebates. I'll start with the 2008 rebate because it's the most stark, and that's the first paper that we did on it. Then I'll talk about the Singapore election year payouts, and then the Australia stimulus during 2008 to 2009. I'm not going to talk about the COVID stimulus for several reasons, because the circumstances are unique. So first of all, I don't think we can draw general results from that for, say, the next recession that comes, because there were supply shocks, there were sectoral shifts, all kinds of things going on. Also, a lot of the spending during COVID was not just to stimulate the economy. I think some of it was. Rather, it was, if the government tells you you cannot go to work, the government needs to compensate people, and that's basically what was happening, providing insurance. So it's a much more complicated thing. Doesn't mean we shouldn't study it, but in terms of drawing general principles, I want to limit it more to recessions, garden variety recessions. All right, did the 2008 US rebates stimulate the economy? I'm going to give you a few details so you can interpret the next graph. So these were enacted in February 2008. So contrary to the older textbooks that said that fiscal wasn't very nimble, it was quite nimble at this period because the economy, it turns out, had just peaked in December 2007, but everybody could already see that the US economy was starting to go downhill. It was $100 billion, so that was 11% of disposable income on a monthly basis. 85% of the tax units received a payment. The average check was $1,000. And it was paid out a little bit in April. 50% of it was paid out in May, then June and July, and then it kind of petered out. So here is US aggregate disposable income and consumption in 2008. The red line is May, just so you can see where you get that 50% of the payment. The green line is disposable income. You just see a very sharp spike in disposable income. The blue line is consumption. You can see a little hump there if you look closely, although there are other humps in there. You just don't see much there. That's why Marty Feldstein, writing in the Wall Street Journal in late 2008, and John Taylor, writing in the AEA Papers and Proceedings in 2009, concluded that the MPC must have been low, and therefore there wasn't much stimulus from this rebate. But a few years later, some influential new microestimates appeared. So Jonathan Parker and his co-authors, Zulelis, Johnson, McClellan, estimated micro MPCs from the 2008 rebate. And they had done this earlier for 2001, as you'll see. But it was very, very neat because entrepreneurial data collection, they had enough foresight to ask the CEX and the Nielsen survey to add a question about when you received your rebate and how much it was. All right, so it's just wonderful that they did this. Great natural experiment because these rebates were distributed randomly by Social Security number that has nothing to do with people's demographic characteristics. And they used what were then standard applied micro methods with two-way fixed effects, and they were exploiting the variation in timing. And they estimated very high MPCs, between 0.5 to 0.9 for total consumption. All right, so the 0.9 was when you looked over 6 months, the 0.5 was over 3 months. And a significant part of that spending was on motor vehicles. Now, if you calibrate a heterogeneous agent model, and I'm going to show this to you, that means that you're going to get huge multipliers on these temporary rebates. Now, policymakers and researchers saw these results, and Jonathan Parker does great empirical work, saw these results, believed the microestimates, and completely ignored the simple macro analysis. When I saw the first version of this paper around 2011, I said, wow, this is impeccable empirical research, but how do we square it with the aggregate? And people would say, I'm not sure. Well, I believe the applied micro, and so then nobody did anything. But I kept asking that question, and finally, we tried to answer it. So in my paper with Jake Orchard and Johannes Wieland, the first one, we used the Parker et al. Estimates to construct counterfactuals, which are what would have happened to aggregate consumption in 2008 if there had been no rebate. So for the micro counterfactual, we multiply the estimated micro MPC by the aggregate path of rebates to calculate what the induced aggregate spending was, but that holds all macro effects constant. Then, to allow for general equilibrium effects, we calibrate a medium scale, two good, two agent, new Keynesian model. The two goods are non-durables and motor vehicles, with the micro estimates to create the consumption counterfactuals. Right. So we define the GE MPC as the response of aggregate consumption to $1 of transfers, allowing for the general equilibrium effects. You can also call this the consumption multiplier. So here's what we get. So PCE is personal consumption expenditures. So these are both for consumption. On the left is going to be the micro counterfactual. On the right is the macro counterfactual. The black line is the actual data. We then show for our model 3 different micro MPCs. One is 0.3. That's smaller than what Parker and them got, but it's going to be relevant, as you'll see in a moment. also the 0.5 and the 0.9, and I'll talk about the red dotted line in a second, all right? According to both the micro and then even more so the macro counterfactual, it says that had there been no rebate, the US economy would have tanked in the summer of 2008 and then would kind of mostly recover compared to those troughs right when Lehman Brothers fails. Okay. So we do really detailed narratives. Oil prices went up and then down, all of those sorts of things. We take green book forecasts. We look at the survey of professional forecasters, look at the most pessimistic survey, and then we even come up with a time series model where we have some foresight and can come up with an even more pessimistic forecast, and that's the red line. According to our forecast, which is more pessimistic than anybody else's, all right, that was the most likely outcome had there been no rebate, was the red line. And all of these are suggesting much, serious recession in the summer of 2008. So how do we reconcile? We actually started working on this project in 2019, but we could not figure out how to reconcile it. But fortunately, there were innovations in the econometrics literature that solved the puzzle, okay? So it turns out, after Parker and them did their analysis using what was then standard, the econometrics literature discovered that two-way fixed effects estimators could be biased because you are inadvertently using the wrong control group. You're using a control group of people who had previously received their rebates and is coming down from a little bit of a party. And when you take that difference, you bias upward your marginal propensities to consume. There was a working paper by Bordeschuk and Harvell, and it's now published, although now it's also with Spies, where they were just doing the econometrics, and they came up with a technique to get rid of this bias, and they applied it to the Broda and Parker Nielsen data for the 2008, and they found much smaller MPCs on non-durables, because the Nielsen data only looks at some non-durables. So we applied their new techniques as well as some new techniques that we developed, and in both cases, we find much lower MPCs. We found an MPC of 0.3 for total consumption, but it was all on motor vehicles. Okay. Now, even with that, though, the macro counterfactual was still implausible. So that's the blue line there. And it's below what we think is the lowest things could go according to our forecast. So then we said, okay, we need to go back to the model. We re-examined the model and says, okay, is there general equilibrium dampening that we need to change? Because as you know, most new Keynesian models amplify. So of course you could think about changing the Taylor rule parameters and those sorts of things. But we actually discovered something that, from an economic point of view, I think is really interesting. We discovered that the relative price of motor vehicles rose in 2008 when the rebates were distributed. And that likely so people with the rebates, some of those went out and bought motor vehicles, but in our model, we also have Ricardian agents, and they have very high intertemporal elasticities of substitution on durable goods. So the Ricardian agents get crowded out and wait till prices aren't so high, so that in the aggregate, you don't see much change in motor vehicles. And we have a lot of graphs in the paper about motor vehicles in particular. So we incorporated an upward sloping short-run supply curve, relative supply curve for motor vehicles in our macro model, calibrate it to elasticities that other people have had for the short run and long run elasticities with respect to price of motor vehicles, and we're able to match the behavior of prices, and it actually reconciles the new micro estimates with the aggregate data. Now the result is that the multiplier on the 2008 rebate, according to this model, and then according to that pessimistic forecast, was below 0.2. So that was our bottom line on the 2008 rebate. So then I'd given a keynote at the Royal Economic Society, and we said, let's do the 2001 rebates. So we looked at those, and I'll just briefly summarize that. In June 2001, the tax rebate checks of $300 or $600 were mailed to almost 100 million households. The total rebates were $38 billion, 6% of initial monthly income, so there was a chance of you seeing it in the aggregate data. Johnson, Parker, and Tsoukalos, that was the first time they added questions to the CEX about a rebate. Now, they construct a non-durable spending category using Anna Maria Lusardi, some work she had done before for the CEX. And for that category, they estimate an MPC of 0.375 for the first 3 months and 0.66 for if you look over a 6-month period. Now, they note but don't show, but they say that they find smaller and statistically insignificant MPCs on total consumption and say, well, it's too noisy, we're just going to look at this category. So what happens when we look at the aggregate data? The green line shows you disposable income, and I'm trying to remember why there's a line there in July, I don't quite remember. And then there's consumption, blue. Again, you definitely see this in aggregate data for disposable consumption, but it's difficult to see for their non-durable category. So for our analysis of the 2001 rebate, we also created macro counterfactuals and argued that they were implausible. Now, with this narrative, we had to deal with the fact that 9/11 happened a few months later, so we spend a lot of time talking about that. So then we investigate how to reconcile the Johnson, Parker, and Tsoukalos microestimates with the behavior of the macro data. And this required a lot of deep work into consumer expenditure categories. And we discovered empirical issues with the particular category they used. So first of all, we figured out that their non-durable category had some durables in it, like jewelry and medical equipment. And then only some of the non-durables that you would see in the Bureau of Economic Analysis category of non-durables, and same with services. So then we started looking, we said, well, what happens if we use BEA categories and match it up there? And we found that for each of the components there, we got slightly negative, slightly positive, or zero on all of those MPC categories. And so then when we started doing MPC by fine classifications, we found sometimes there were negative MPCs for some categories and positive ones for others. So you might have had some kind of expenditure switching due to the rebate. There's a lot of noise there. It's hard to say. But when we use those alternative categories that are linked up to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, we basically found MPCs near zero. So, and especially with total consumption, we found an MPC near zero. Now, we didn't need to go mess with a macro model because a macro model with an MPC of zero for a transfer is going to give you the actual data. So that's the same as what you would get with the black line that we'd had in the previous graph. So there was no need to modify it. And so the bottom line there was we just didn't see much evidence that there was stimulus to the aggregate economy based on those rebates. Okay, so in honor of talking at the IMF, I'm now going to go outside the US. One reason I don't do that very much is to do a really good analysis. You really have to understand the country and the period that you're studying. So I will say these are preliminary, and if anybody wants to say, tell me afterwards or during the discussion, oh no, you missed this key thing about Singapore, or you missed this key thing about Australia, I welcome that, because it is really hard to delve in there and make sure you're understanding everything. So why did I choose Singapore? So one thing, because I didn't have much time to do this, I wanted a country where, for some reason, it was interesting in terms of transfers, and where I thought they would have really good national accounts in English. And Singapore was a perfect example. I looked there, and they were great. So the reason other than having national accounts in English, I was also interested in Singapore because there was a very nice additional study on the effects of transfers by Agarwal and Chien in the 2014 AER. And they exploited a very interesting natural experiment in Singapore. So Singapore is also interesting because it's a small open economy. So once again, I'm doing something different from the US. But this case study is useful because it demonstrates the following. Sometimes it's very difficult to make a credible plausibility case, and I'll show you here. But the steps in the process, all that digging I did, actually led to a serendipitous discovery. So what was their natural experiment? In February 2011, the government had a surprise announcement that they were going to have a program of payments to Singapore citizens, just a temporary one, to share the nation's economic growth. So it was $3.2 billion in Singapore dollars, with $1.5 billion the growth dividends that Agarwal and Chiang focused on. They got $600 to $800 per individual, and it favored lower income people. The payments were 11% of monthly personal disposable income, so I'm going, yes, I can see this in the aggregate, that's what I need. And here's the really interesting thing for their study. Foreigners, who are 40% of the population, were ineligible. Okay, so that was going to be their control group. And these growth dividend payments announced in February were dispersed near the end of April. And here's a picture of the happy family getting their growth dividends. This also makes me happy because this is where I made the serendipitous discovery when I looked at this article. And I'll tell you about that in a sec. So their analysis is just fantastic. They use a proprietary data set from the largest Singapore bank, 180,000 consumers, monthly panel, information on credit and debit card, bank checking account spending. They don't know the dividend payment, but because there are clear rules on how it's given out, they're able to impute the dividend payment based on those rules and the individual characteristics. And the control group is the foreigners who didn't get any. So they estimate a distributed lag model of consumption on the growth dividend, interactive with announcement date and disbursement date, and they also have individual month and fixed effects. That's not a problem in this case because they're not trying to do, they have their control group right. So it's an ideal natural experiment, rich data, great control group. Now in the paper they show, a lot of the things they feature are dummy variables, but then they show for certain components the actual impulse response. And I wanted that, and I emailed them, and they nicely sent me the estimates and standard errors of the particular one that I wanted to see, which combined the two types of card spending, because most of the spending was using debit or credit cards. So the first red line, month 0, which was February 2011, is when they have the announcement. And then the second one is when they have the payout. Now, when they use the dummy variables for that interval between the announcement and payout, it's statistically different from 0. You get a little less precision here. This is the cumulative MPC. But it definitely goes up, and you can see there don't seem to be any pre-treatment effects. And it goes up, and they hit, and this is what they say also as their summary of their results, is that they have a cumulative marginal propensity to consume after 10 months of 80 cents on the dollar. All right, so huge marginal propensity to consume. And then if you take basically just the difference of that, you can get the month-by-month marginal propensity to consume. And I wanted to show you that because that's what my colleague Adrian Auclair and his co-authors call the intertemporal MPC, or IMPC. It's the MPC not just in the impact period, but also looking out over time. Now, what are the general equilibrium implications? Well, a paper by a different Agarwal, notice there are 2 Gs in this one, so it's a different person, Auclair, Rognley, and Straub in the NBR Macro Annual recently, analyzed fiscal policy in small open economies with heterogeneous agents. And they showed that if the economy is completely open and the central bank keeps interest rates fixed in response to this policy, then the response of aggregate consumption should actually be identical to the IMPCs from the microdata, and the response of imports should be identical to the IMPCs because this is a completely open economy, and Singapore certainly meets that requirement. So let's look at the aggregate data in Singapore. So this is from their national accounts. So the blue line is disposable income, and the green is consumption expenditures. You can see the payout in that spike in the disposable income, which is otherwise quite flat there. Consumption, you could think, well, maybe there's something. It's hard to see. It's rather noisy. There's all kinds of other humps. So when I looked at that, and given that prolonged MPC, I said, I can do a counterfactual. I can't argue it's implausible. So this was just 2 weeks ago, and I thought, uh-oh, here's a failed one. But there was some serendipity. So in the process of looking at this, they never said why the government suddenly gave this payout. It was called the growth dividend payout. So I started searching, and that's where I found that article and several others, but that Straits Times one with the happy family, because I was worried about endogeneity with respect to some kind of macro thing. Well, my research revealed that 2011 was an election year in Singapore. Singapore parliamentary, and then I studied all about Singapore's elections. Their parliamentary elections must be held at least every 5 years. And the government sometimes gives out large payments to citizens just before the election, but not to non-voting foreigners. And it turns out that the 2011 growth dividend studied by Agarwal and Chan was the third such payout during an election year since 2000. Now, I found some other instances of payouts, one in 2008, but I was worried that that was a response to the global financial crisis. I didn't include that. There were a couple other payouts, so this is that they gave to citizens to make up for the fact that they had just raised the goods and services tax. So I think this is Singapore's way of taxing foreigners more than citizens. So I didn't use those either, but those are other kind of interesting things. So there was $2.7 billion in 2001 from the new Singapore shares. Now these were a little bit more complicated. Only half could be cashed the first year, so I only used half of that value in what's going to be an external instrument. 2006 progress package, $2.6 billion, and then the one in 2011. The whole program was $3.2 billion, but $1.5 billion was transfers. So I used narrative methods to create an external instrument using the cash values, appropriately adjusted by which parts could be cashed, of those payouts during election years. Now, if somebody who didn't have the experience I did would have said, I can't get anything out of 3 observations. Well, Matthew Shapiro and I had 3 military dummy variables, and we got a dummy variable military news that only took the value of 1 3 times, and we got a lot of mileage out of that. So I held my breath and ran an SFAR model with an external instrument. So I took the quarterly national accounts, I excluded the Asia crisis and COVID, so 1999 through 2019. I have a 4-variable structure vector autoregression. So the first variable is the external instrument. I use either the announcement or the payout. And then the others are real disposable income, real consumption, and real saving. And because I can't take logs of 0, because these payouts are usually 0, and because I want to be able to compare things, all variables are as a percent of a trend disposable income estimated from a polynomial trend. I also tried just doing logs for the national income variables and got similar qualitative results. And then I just estimate the impulse response to either the announcement or the payout, a shock to the announcement variable or the payout. So let's look first at the announcement. All right. So there's a program announcement in period 0, and then it goes back to normal, which is what it should be, because these are temporary. That's where I was holding my breath. It had to show up in disposable income, and it does. It's not by 1. I normalized that to 1. So it doesn't show up initially, but then usually there's a quarter delay to when the payout is, and you see that. So it goes up to about 0.5. Consumption is just not doing anything there. In contrast, savings goes way up. In fact, it goes up more than disposable income, which I have to think more about. It might be some kind of measurement error thing in the way they take some of these growth dividends, how they count them. Here's the response to the payout variable. So program payout, because it's just the payout variable, it hits 1, normalized, and then goes back to normal. Disposable income definitely goes up. There's also some kind of other hump a year later. I'm not quite sure what that is. That's something I'd like to look at more. But consumption is just doing nothing. Saving goes way up, and then you also have that secondary hump a year later. Again, I'm not quite sure why that is. But I am just not seeing any effect on consumption. So I'm finding a significant effect on aggregate disposable income, on aggregate saving, but not on consumption expenditures. I also did robustness checks. I downloaded the aggregate monthly retail series. I even split them between motor vehicles and not motor vehicles. No significant effects. I also looked at imports. I didn't see any effects on imports. So there's a puzzle that still needs reconciliation, but somebody else can solve this. Because I can't look at the original. If I go to Singapore, I can actually look at the original data. So maybe I should go to Singapore and look at that. But how do they find such high MPCs in the micro data from what looks like a very good study, but the macro data is suggesting an MPC is equal to 0. So this is, again, where you have to dig around in the micro data to see, or if there's or we have to change our macro models is another possibility. Okay, so let's go not so far from Singapore to Australia. So why did I choose Australia, other than the fact that I knew they would have good national income and product accounts in English? Let's talk about the state of the Australian economy during the global financial crisis. So they entered the crisis period with budget surpluses. Their financial system remained sound all the way through. Top Australian banks still rated AA or better. They were among the few banks left in the world, by the end of the crisis, that still had very high ratings. Their exports began to recover early in 2009 because the global financial crisis didn't affect the East Asian economies as much. And so they were exporting a lot, particularly to China, in terms of minerals and things like that. The Reserve Bank of Australia cash rate bottomed out at 3%. So they had lots of room between the zero lower bound and 3%. So they were far above the zero lower bound. Nevertheless, Australia enacted huge fiscal stimulus. According to a really good 2009 Australian Senate report that sort of reviewed the stimulus and what they thought, they had a lot of opposing ideas, people testifying about whether it was needed, how much it affected. They said that the reason they enacted the stimulus was because of the dire IMF predictions for the global economy. And it's true that the global financial crisis was very rough for the global economy, but it didn't really affect Australia that much. So Australia had the third highest payments as a percent of GDP during the global financial crisis after the US and South Korea. They had, in October 2008, they announced, and then they disbursed in December that year, 10.4 billion in Australian dollars transfers to households. Then in February, they announced 42 billion. 12.7 of that was transfers disbursed in April 2009. 26 billion was infrastructure. And then again in May, they said, let's add 22 billion more for infrastructure. So here's the Australian data, disposable income. You can definitely see the transfer payments being paid out there. And the blue line is consumption. It's going down, so they did have declines in consumption, and maybe there's a little blip there, but it's a little hard to say. Here's what savings does. Basically, savings goes up as much as disposable income that first time, not quite as much the second time, so there might be some room there to say that some of that was spent. Here's the Reserve Bank of Australia cash rate. So they started dropping it significantly in 2008. And then it was basically kept constant for the first 2/3 of 2009. And then they started raising it. All right? So they were not stuck at the zero lower bound. If you look at government purchases, notice that it's flat for much of 2008. And then it really goes up. Almost all of that is the infrastructure spending, okay, that comes online. So how much did the fiscal payments stimulate the economy? So Andrew Lee had a nice paper where he used the same methods as Shapiro and Slemrod, which are survey methods, asking people how much of the rebate they spent. Shapiro and Slemrod had done it for the US. He did it for Australia. Used survey data, asking consumers, how much of the transfers did you spend? Used their same ways of trying to turn that into an MPC, and he gets an MPC of 0.4, so pretty high. I just, a week ago, ran across this paper, recently published in the JMCB, from Aisbett, Bruckner, Steinhauser, and Wilcox. They used Australian Nielsen household data with information on the receipt of transfers, and they estimated MPC near 0. Okay, so once again, this is this wide range of estimates. So let's see what Andrew Lee's rather high MPC of 0.4 implies about the counterfactual. So I calibrate, once again, the Agarwal, Auclair, Rognley, and Strob's small open economy Hank model to Lee's estimates to create counterfactuals for consumption and GDP. I set the openness parameter at 0.2 to match Australia, because they're somewhat open, but not as open as Singapore. And I include both the transfer payouts and infrastructure spending, since both of those are going on at the same time. Now, in general, the multiplier on G, purchases, will be equal to the transfers multiplier plus 1. So you always expect to find a bigger multiplier on infrastructure spending. So what do we get? The black line is the actual path of consumption over this period there, and then GDP. And the counterfactuals using Andrew Lee's MPC of 0.4 give us a very different picture. Those are the green lines. A very sharp decline in consumption. Now remember, this is when exports are starting to recover, but according to the counterfactual, you would have had a very sharp decline in consumption, and it would take a while to get back to what we have as the actual path. GDP, not quite so sharp, but still quite a difference from what actually happened. So one of the things that Jake Orchard and Johannes Wieland and I would do in our other papers for the US is compare the decline in consumption to other historical periods. Now, I haven't put COVID in here. The decline in consumption during COVID in Australia was 14%, so that was unusual. So the actual Australian data said that the decline in consumption from peak to trough was 1%. For this counterfactual with an MPC of 0.4, it's minus 4.2%. For the second biggest one, excepting COVID, was for the Australian data was in the 1975, where the decline was 2.6%. And then the US during the global financial crisis, the decline was 2.4%. So I can't give you a definitive answer right now, but how could Australia have done so much worse than the US, given that their banks were doing well, their exports were picking up? And so I think it's unlikely that the MPC would be as high as 0.4. Now, of course, there are lingering consequences. Remember, I mentioned Australia went into the global financial crisis with a surplus. So their debt to GDP ratio was 10%, but they had the third biggest stimulus of any country. And you can see, and then of course they had that infrastructure program, which may have been very useful, but that certainly increased the debt. They weren't raising taxes to finance it. Then it goes up again during COVID, something of a decline. I don't know if they had inflation, but probably did. And they at least look like they're not on an upward path like the US is doing. But there was a lingering consequence to them being frightened about what they thought was this tsunami coming for Australia, and it's not clear it really would have come. And they had more room with monetary policy to try to stimulate the economy more there because they were above the zero lower bound. So, few conclusions. So first of all, I've offered you some evidence that I'm just not sure that temporary transfers offer much stimulus in practice. Okay? So I've given you several examples from advanced economies. I was hoping to do at least one developing economy, but just ran out of time. I have some ideas there because Brazil does all kinds of interesting things. So I might have a chance to look at that at some other point in time. So the question is, are they different? Do they actually do they have more stimulus effect there? That's entirely a possibility. But one should try to do one of these plausibility analyses to address that. And then maybe the permanent income hypothesis isn't such a bad approximation. All right, that's certainly what we saw in these 4 examples. That you might statistically reject it, but quantitatively, those rejections might not be so important. And then I've also offered this idea of doing historical plausibility analysis to help you choose among these estimates. It's really surprising how much academics, particularly, just completely disregarded the aggregate data in 2008 and just didn't pay attention to it, and then thought that applied micro was just so much better that we can just take that and put it in our macro models. I mean, I kept asking people, and people would say, I don't know. And it would have been useful if I could have come up with answers earlier, maybe, before COVID, but I didn't. The cost of the stimulus packages was high. Okay. The deficit finance stimulus payments during the 2 crises raised debt to GDP ratios to risky levels. And by many accounts, a number of countries are on unsustainable paths. And a big part of the high level of debt is the ratchet up effect during those 2 crises. Now, in COVID, there were reasons to spend other things. In the global financial crisis, yes, we probably needed some more infrastructure in the US. I'm not sure about Australia. But did we really need to spend quite so much? And let me talk about another, because I wasn't sure I would have time. Yes. And of course, rather than being on an unsustainable debt path, you could raise taxes. Now, in my Journal of Economic Perspectives paper, I talked about the various estimates for the effects of taxes, and I also looked at how robust those results were in my handbook chapter. Because when David and Christy Romer first came out with their narrative series and were finding tax multipliers of -2 to -3, I said, something must be wrong here. So I started digging. I could not dislodge that result. Maybe make it a little bit smaller. And then Mertens and Ravin did their refinements on David and Christie's thing, and they kept getting really high results. And I said, well, maybe it's something in the US, maybe people who cut taxes also deregulate, and we're picking up both. But then James Cloyne did it for the UK, and somebody whose name I don't remember did it for Germany, and then Daniel Lee and his team here at the IMF did all of their studies of the narrative fiscal consolidations. And when they split fiscal consolidations according to whether they're spending-based, which is the red line, versus tax-based, they find much more negative effects of raising taxes than cutting spending. And this is not even a pure effect because they have to kind of, it's just, are they mostly tax or are they mostly spending? So say you take a multiplier of -2. That means that dollar that you sent out as a transfer payment, unless you want to just keep on that unsustainable debt path, you're going to have to lose $2 of GDP to finance it. And that's something I think that's worth keeping in mind. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. This was really very stimulating, and it continues in the tradition of Mundell-Fleming lectures that are also meant to stimulate us and push us a little bit outside our comfort zone, perhaps. So I am very grateful for that. We will open the floor to questions. There are 3 mics in the aisles. Please go behind the mics, and then we will take your questions. But while people are getting there, let me start with maybe a few initial reactions. So if I think about what you just presented to us. There is one part which is, did we estimate the MPCs right? And then we can challenge that, maybe the econometrics, maybe the two-way fixed effects, maybe some other things. Maybe they are not as high as some of the micro literature has said. That's part one. To get to zero and really the permanent income hypothesis, I think that you have to really push and think that there are absolutely no frictions that would lead people to be constrained in how much they want to spend. And in fact, if I look, for instance, at some of the estimates that were done in 2021 by Raj Chetty and his team, John Friedman and co-authors, you do find they're using credit card data, very high frequency data, so that doesn't suffer from a lot of these econometric problems. You do see the increase in spending for the low income households, for instance, in the US when they receive their checks. So there is a part here where it's maybe not 0.9, maybe not 0, I don't know where you land in the end. Then there's the mapping from that to the aggregate multiplier. And here I kind of want to ask, well, how much do you trust the model? In order to make that mapping, you need a model. So how comfortable are you in tracking the model? And then I kind of want to end and come back to COVID-19. Okay. You were careful, you were very careful in your remarks in saying, COVID-19, I'm not going to look at it. There are other reasons. You're absolutely right. That's something that I and others have looked at. And you have very, very low fiscal multipliers for the obvious reason that, you are not, a lot of sectors were constrained on the supply side. There was no way you could increase output. But do I really want to think that somehow during COVID or any other time, all of that transfer went into savings, none of it went into desired spending? That would have the very interesting implication that none of the inflation surge we saw in COVID and afterwards would have a fiscal nature. And I think we've heard papers in the last 2 days that would take basically the opposite side. So I want to put it to you. How do you view this? Okay. We can start with that. Yeah. Then please go and go to the mics, and then we'll have some more exchanges.
All right. So thank you. Very good questions. So the first one on the permanent income hypothesis. So we do find an MPC of 0.3 in the 2008. But think about what that was on. That was on a durable good, a motor vehicle. All right. So many of these heterogeneous agent New Keynesian models, Hank models, say, oh, it's really important to have two assets, and they usually have an illiquid asset and a liquid asset. We really should think about durables being an asset, and particularly for low-income households who aren't in the stock market, if you get a transfer, one of the best ways you might be able to spend it is to invest in a durable good. And in fact, if you think about the people who were smart enough to go out and buy cars during COVID with their transfer, they made very significant capital gains because the price of used cars actually went up relative to the original. So I think we need to think more seriously in terms of the permanent income hypothesis, exactly how they're spending it. But now, this spending could still stimulate the economy, because even if we say it's really investment, it can stimulate the economy potentially. But if everybody in the aggregate goes out to buy the same items from the same industry, in our case it was motor vehicles, then you have to start thinking about upward sloping short run effects. So that part of the model is just kind of straightforward, almost micro kinds of things happening there. And you're absolutely right about the model, how to confront. We tried to take an off-the-shelf model, calibrated the way other people had in terms of what was going on with monetary policy, what the Frisch elasticity was, and all those things. Now, in the very first version of the paper, we said, oh, here's how we can get dampening effects. We just scale down that Frisch elasticity. We scale down model utilization. But if you want to do that, it's informative to do this plausibility analysis to give you that. On COVID, yes, there was an inflation surge. Now, fiscal theory, Francesco Bianchi had to go to a faculty meeting today, but the fiscal theory of the price level says you don't have to have a stimulus effect to get a fiscal effect on inflation. But also monetary policy was very stimulative because interest rates were kept at the zero lower bound for a long time. So there are other possibilities.
Excellent. We'll start with you, and please introduce yourself and then ask your question to Valerie.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Nikita Raman. I'm a student at Georgetown University. Since you talked about emerging economies very briefly at the end, I wanted to ask about the case of China's current balance sheet recession. The dynamic of fiscal transfers being ineffective in the case where people are more willing to pay down their debts than they are to consume anything is obviously at play there, yet monetary stimulus has shown little effect and debt restructuring is projected not to do very much. So there are increasing calls for a fiscal transfer by the Chinese government. Obviously, that's a large question, but what would your preliminary estimation of the best response be? Thank you so much.
Okay.
Let's gather maybe a couple. So please, sir.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Ivai Warsov. I'm an economist at the IMF. So I have a question on the legacy costs of the stimulus, the graphs you showed on debt to GDP. I was wondering, what are your thoughts about the quantification of how much it is the stimulus itself that's caused the increase in debt, and how much of it is consequences of a crisis, for example, during the GFC or post-GFC slow growth? So like being able to disentangle the kind of the direct legacy costs from the transfers versus other dynamics.
Feel like having another one, and then
Sure, that's fine.
please.
Hi, Carlo Pizzinelli from the European Department. Given that you started the presentation talking about heterogeneous agent models that try to look at transfers, I was wondering if you can talk about the role of the targeting of the transfers for going from the micro MPCs, because obviously those vary across households, especially during recessions, to the macro ones. And also perhaps the role of communications by the government when the transfer happens, because of course if, in expectations of a recession, an uninformed household gets a transfer and the government says, well, you should keep this transfer because hard times are coming, but perhaps the household doesn't have a shock coming. I'm going to have a high precautionary saving motive that essentially leads to a zero MPC. But it's all in the communication, perhaps. Thank you.
Okay, Valerie.
Okay. All right. So first of all, Nikki's question on about consumers paying down the debt. Actually, one of the papers by Agrawal Suleilis of the JPE actually found that paying down your debt was a significant part of the transfers they looked at in another period. But of course, paying down your debt is the same as an increase in savings. So it shows up in the aggregate data as the increase in savings. It's just one of the ways that they save, which is paying down their debt. Best response for China, I haven't looked at China, and as I indicated before, I really want to know a country before I try to say something intelligent about it. So I suggest that they look to see what's happened during their past transfers to see if what the MPCs look like, if they have any data on that. On the debt to GDP, how much was slow growth? Yes, obviously some of it was slow growth, but I had previously, it was actually for a panel talk, looked at debt to GDP ratios where I looked at more like pre-trend GDP. And you still see significant rises in debt, not just because GDP went down, but because $1 trillion, for example, in the US was spent on the ARRA, and then before that, the Bush tax cuts. So yes, part of that rise is the slow growth, but a big part of it is due to the government outlays. And then targeting transfers, yes, in a Hank model, if you target to people who are more likely to spend, that will have a bigger multiplier. Now, most of these programs in Singapore and Australia were actually targeting more to the lower income people. So they were at least partially targeted, but I didn't see a big stimulus effect there. But that's certainly something that deserves more research, because you might be able to find groups who are willing to take those resources and go out and have a party. And that's what the government is hoping for.
Let's turn to Jesper.
Yeah, Jesper Linde, IMF. Very nice presentation. I want to ask you, Valerie, if you think that these effects are sort of symmetric, so we can think about, say, general tax, lump sum tax hikes as a very sort of costless way to bring down debt, which has been a thing we've been talking about. And then the other question, you didn't make such a big distinction between, say, discretionary versus automatic stabilizers, the extent to which some of these stimulus was sort of part of automatic stabilizers rather than discretionary. It would be interesting to hear your views on that.
Hi. So, Valerie, so thanks for an interesting presentation. So I think a couple of sort of comments. So one of them is that, so I have a paper that looks at the cross-sectional estimates from the 2001-2008 stimulus payments, and the multiplier in the cross-sections are only about 1/3 on GDP. So a multiplier of 1/3 versus 0 are not all that different. So to some extent, it's not all that surprising from that evidence, a little bit consistent. Also, if you sort of think of a MPC of maybe 1/3, and then in a model where the economy is not at the zero lower bound, as it wasn't in the start of 2008 and 2001, also you wouldn't expect to see a big multiplier. And then a third comment is in the Australian case, there's also a big response in. We should also look at commodity prices, because there was there were some movements in that around the financial crisis. Thanks.
Can I add also to Jesper's question? I thought this was, so if the multiplier is 0 when you have cash transfers, I think Jesper is saying, well, can we do it in reverse? If we were able to do lump sum taxes, would it be a painless way of consolidation? And then would you then look at the kind of estimates we have on the output effect of tax-based consolidation as just a pure effect of the distortions coming from the taxes, and would that be plausible?
Okay, so these are great questions, yours and Jesper's combined. So it would be very neat to see if the effect is asymmetric. I mean, the closest that we have to that was the government shutdowns and the studies that Matthew Shapiro and his co-authors did. And it's been a little bit since I've read those, but if I recall, what people were doing was just retiming their expenditures. So they could wait a month to pay their mortgage, and would do things so that once you look, you had to be careful about high frequency, saying that there's a big effect, because some of it is just intertemporal timing. So that's probably the only evidence. Now, I was going to quip that, yeah, it would be great to see if they ever raise taxes again in the US, but of course the taxes that are raised are usually the distortionary type, in which case there could be all these supply side effects. So I don't know of any natural experiments other than the government shutdown where you would have something that's closer to a lump sum thing, but that would be really, that's really important to study, but I don't have the answer to that. And then Jesper, you talked about discretionary versus these autonomous or automatic payments. So when we created the co-authored work and what I did here, I took the path of only the discretionary payment to look at it. So the question is, what would have happened? I have to think about what it implies in terms of the other, but I think it's netted out with the way we did it, but I will think about that a little bit more. In the cross-sectional 2001, 2008 on the MPC, so it was a footnote in an earlier version of the 2008 rebate paper, but then referees told us we didn't need to go into so much detail. But there's some possible, those cross-sectional estimates aren't as robust as one might like. It was that high MPC came when you threw out the outliers. So one would want to look at that a little bit more. On the Australian case, yes, the commodity prices are interesting. So the terms of trade, if I recall, it went way up in 2008 and then came way down in the beginning of 2009. And here's a case where I really do need to study more international to think about, the deeper issues with the terms of trade.
Okay. I don't see any other questions. I can add one of my own.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the premise for your lecture, you started by illustrating how debt levels have increased, certainly something that we have been watching very closely. But then the question is, how much needs to be done and what should be the target?
For debt.
So yes, and here let me expand a little bit. Your argument would be maybe we did a lot of things that were not very stimulative, maybe at a time when they were supposed to be stimulative, but they weren't. And so we end up with these elevated debt levels. But at the same time, there's a question about how much debt levels can be tolerated. And as long as you can service it, as long as there's enough growth, as long as interest rates are not too high, perhaps. Do you have views on this?
Well, I have some in part because of the external evaluation I was doing, the IMF, and then I was also recently on some panels. I mean, I think you really have to look at stochastic debt analysis. And you cannot just take where interest rates were recently or now. And the problem is that shocks that decrease GDP growth can also raise the interest rate you have to pay. So you can end up in very bad states of the economy. So I think that what you need is some kind of fiscal rule to gradually bring things back in. So this was just for the US, but the recent Auerbach and Yagan paper did something very interesting. In 2003, Alan Auerbach had a Brookings paper where he looked at legislated changes to deficits in response to projected deficits, and found that they tended to reduce the deficit through legislative means gradually, but did it enough so that when they did their stochastic debt analysis, the probability of staying under 200% was, with 95% probability if you use those parameters. Then Alan Auerbach and Danny Yagan redid the analysis, but for 2004 up to the present. And the coefficient on the feedback rule is 0. So there's just no reaction. And when you plug that into the debt sustainability analysis, you can't even keep things under 500. This is for the next 100 years, 500 or even higher with anything above 20% probability. And it's the unknowns, the known unknowns, and given the current geopolitical situation, the chance that the US needs to raise military spending is high, and they haven't left any fiscal space because of all of this spending during the two crises.
Okay, well, on this cheering note, do you have a question, sir? Then you need to go to the mic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enoch Bolime. How does the degree of conditionality on the transfers affect the estimates for the MPC?
So some of the studies find that it does have an effect. I haven't personally looked deeply into this, so when we went back to the consumer expenditure survey, we didn't look at it by income levels, so I don't have much to add to the literature on that, but potentially, yes, you can imagine that having conditionality, and particularly in emerging markets, you could have higher MPCs and higher stimulus. So that's why I was very careful to say what I've shown you is for advanced economies, and I think it would be very useful to study it for other economies as well.
Well, so please join me in thanking Valerie for a really stimulating Mundell-Fleming lecture. Thank you. And I believe we have a coffee break until 3:15, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you, everyone.